back to Factor Nostalgia, where we normally discuss any and everything theme park, then, now, and when. But this week, I wanted to talk about Disney's live action remakes. And in part one of this episode, we talked about the movies that have come out so far and the issues that I had with some of them, what made some of them actually not so bad, and then also what we see in the upcoming releases, the scheduled releases for live action remakes or CG remakes or whatever you want to call them, and how it seems to be more of the stuff that I take issue with. And I know I'm not the only one who has these problems with these remakes. Now, that I'll put aside, we're going to get to the better part of this episode, which is talking about which movies actually deserve a remake now that we know what works and what doesn't. Okay, so just to quickly recap, what to me and a lot of others does not work is shot-for-shot remakes, wrong casting, just casting that doesn't seem appropriate, weird forced songs that they put in there, and I don't know if that's because they want to be nominated for, best original song or whatever, but they're all awkward and stuff. So, there's that. Stuff that does work is if you add to the story without it being forced, if it feels organic, which means that you're going to have to change a little bit about the format in which you're telling the story. So the movies, the animated classics that in my eyes deserve a remake, and whether that's live action or something else or a different style of animation, that doesn't really matter to me. But there are some movies that are just underrated. And I know that this is very personal, but there are some definite fan favorites. Now, if we go back to the original reasoning that I think Disney has for trying to sort of refresh these characters and bring them back, bring them more top of mind to millennials and their children, because, we're the audience that has the money now, allegedly. If that's the motivation, then it wouldn't hurt them to kind of listen to what these fan favorites are and see if they can make improvements on those movies and bring those back in a different form, in a different medium. Okay, so I'm going to do a list, a top 10, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so if you're listening to this right now, feel free to head on over to Instagram at Factor Nostalgia, drop your opinions there. You can email me, or you can even leave a comment on the podcast itself if you're listening on Spotify. All right, let's get into it, shall we? Now, a little disclaimer, this top 10 isn't super ranked in and of itself, but I am going to start with some maybe more obvious choices and then work my way down my list that I have into maybe some unconventional choices. But, whether they really are or not, I'll leave that up to you, to your judgment. Here we go. Now, my first pick has to be The Black Cauldron. This is an animated movie that came out in 1985, and Disney tends to kind of act like it didn't happen. So the main princess in the story is never talked about, Princess Ailonwi, and this was the only animated movie to get a PG rating because there were some very graphic, scary-ish scenes. Now, production-wise, this movie had, it was quite an effort to get this movie made. Since it was made in the mid-'80s, by then Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg came in, for those of you who know a little bit more about the background. And the story goes that even during production, they had switched directors several times because they couldn't agree on the tone of the movie, and it got darker and darker. And once during a screening, it turned out that some of these scenes were way too scary for the kids watching the screening. So Jeffrey Katzenberg decided that some of it needed to be cut. And he went to work. I mean, he really wanted to cut a whole bunch of the movie. Then at some point, something behind the scenes happened. Michael Eisner stepped in. He said, "You can't really do this, not this much." So he did stop. But in the end, about 12 minutes of the movie were cut. If you really look for it, you can still find some of it, at least, on YouTube and things like that. And if you look closely at the movie, in one of the scarier scenes, which is, there's this cauldron scene with all these minions and creatures coming out of it, and that's where a lot of the cutting didn't happen as seamlessly as it should have been. Um, yeah. So the whole movie was plagued by a whole bunch of different things. Now, this was one of the first movies, or maybe even the first movie, to make use of CG animation. And again, this is why you know that Disney doesn't want to talk about this movie, because they like to pretend that Beauty and the Beast is the first movie in which they used CG, which clearly isn't true because this came out in 85 and even The Rescuers Down Under back in 1990 had some CG scenes. But I digress. So, in terms of effects and, the visual style and everything, even though it was very dark, it was still impressive for its time. But I think the story suffered under the production, and Disney didn't really know what to do with this movie. So that's why you don't hear a whole lot about it. Now, in the meantime, the story itself isn't bad. It was loosely based on a book, and the author of the movie even had something to say about it, where he said the movie doesn't really resemble the book, but even if you watch the movie in a vacuum, it's enjoyable, it's pretty good. But that does mean that there is some opportunity there to improve upon the story. And I've never read the book, so I don't know how far apart these two stories are. But knowing that, and knowing that there's 12 minutes that were cut from the original movie, and knowing what we can do now with visual effects, whether in animation or, in something else, I think this movie is due for I don't want to say a reboot or a remake, but it deserves some love. And not just from the audience, but also from Disney itself. So I think this is an excellent candidate for, if you want to revive something, this is a really good candidate. Plus, can you imagine the Horned King with today's visual effects? I mean, that's something I would pay to see. So now, on to my second pick. The second movie on my list is The Sword in the Stone. And the reason for that is some of it is somewhat similar to the Black Cauldron, but a little bit less in the sense that there's a lot of references to The Sword in the Stone throughout the Disney parks, throughout other Disney media. So, for example, for those of you that play, for example, Disney Dreamlight Valley, Merlin has a really big role in it, right? So, Merlin is a pretty iconic character in the Disney universe, but I don't feel like a lot of people saw the movie. I feel like a lot of parents right now need to explain to their kids who Merlin is. Now, for a quick little history lesson on the movie itself, it was something that Walt Disney himself was a little reluctant to produce at first because he just wanted to focus on other things. So this was back in the 60s, right? This movie came out in 1963, and Disney was very focused on his parks and not so much the movies. So he only approved movies every now and then. It was between The Sword in the Stone and Chanticleer, which never got made, which is, from what I could find, it's originally a story, kind of a satire, societal satire, starring farm animals. So I'm very curious as to how they would have done that. But Walt Disney decided to greenlight The Sword in the Stone instead. Now, this story is kind of like the prelude to King Arthur, how King Arthur came to be, and really how he learned valuable life lessons with the help of Merlin the Wizard. The only thing that I'm not sure of, if they were to do a remake or a reboot of this movie ever, is if they were to do a live action version. That means that all the different animals that you have in the movie, or all the different scenes that include animals. So for those of you that haven't seen it, these lessons that Arthur learns are often by transforming into different animals. And if you do that in the way they have been doing CG in these movies, it's going to look dated really soon, really quickly. So if there's a way to do it with, I don't know, puppets or something not CG. So for example, if you look at Jurassic Park, it still looks good because it's not all computer generated. So if they can do something like that, I think that would work really well. But this one you kind of have to be careful with if you're going to do a remake, to make it look good and make it look timeless. That being said, I do think this movie deserves more attention than it's currently getting. On to number 3. Now, third on my list, I have Treasure Planet, which probably some of you saw coming. And a lot of that also has to do with the point I mentioned before about, things looking dated. Now, this movie came out in 2002, but it was a long way to get this movie made. So it was originally pitched in 1985 together with The Little Mermaid. So this was pitched by Ron Clements, who also, had a big hand in The Little Mermaid, writing and directing it. Michael Eisner said no. And in 1989, when The Little Mermaid got released, they tried it again. And studio still said no. Then Aladdin came out, which was in 92. And Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the head of animation at the time, said no. So by then, Clements and his buddy John Musker were so frustrated by all the rejections they have gotten that they went to Roy E. Disney, who was still on the board at the time, or chairman. So he decided to, you know what, I'm going to go to Eisner and talk to him. Eisner said, okay, you know what, yes, we should produce the movie, and we're going to do that after we finish working on Hercules. So in the meantime, the technology for animation had changed so much that the director duo could actually do more with the movie than what they initially wanted, which wasn't possible at the time when they first pitched the movie. So in that sense, it was a good thing that it got delayed. So they really started working on it in 2000. Now, Treasure Planet is, of course, based on Treasure Island, which is a book from the late 1800s, and it has a bunch of different remakes. But this movie makes it different because it takes place in space, right? What also made this movie different was the techniques used. So they made this movie using a blend of traditional animation, so 2D animation. They made use of 3D animation and then computer-generated environments. And on the one hand, at the time it was super impressive. But what also is immediately the pitfall of stuff like this is that it's going to look dated because you know that by now there's more that we can do. That being said, it's not, yeah, you can see that it was created, in the 2000s, but it doesn't look as dated as like when you look at, for example, some of the superhero movies that were made on a relatively lower budget from a couple years ago. They already look more dated than Treasure Planet. So, I don't want to completely dog on the animation here because it's not so bad, but I do think that it could do with a refresh. I do think that the movie also suffered a little bit from just the time it came out because Disney was already in sort of an animation slump. And then it came out around the same time as a new Harry Potter movie and a new James Bond movie. So, that's a lot to compete with. James Bond might not be directly the same target audience. Harry Potter, there's definitely going to be some overlap there. So that makes it a little tricky. But it is, I think, very good storytelling wise. And it just, much like the Black Cauldron, it just deserves more love. It does. All right. Next up, number 4. You guessed it, Atlantis. Now, Atlantis fully officially, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, came out in 2001. So that same era where Disney was kind of struggling to, how to come off of the Disney Renaissance and still make these impactful movies. This was the first one where they said, you know what, we're not going to do musicals anymore, or at least this one's not going to be a musical. And obviously, it's based on the legend of Atlantis. Now, this movie was still traditionally animated. And, as we mentioned with Treasure Planet, there was already a shift towards more computer animation. So that was already tricky to compete with. Plus, the movie came out around the same time as Shrek. Now, we all know, I don't know anybody who doesn't like the Shrek movies, or at least the first one. Still, it didn't do too badly, even though the critical response was a little less favorable. Some of this had to do with people simply expecting Disney to have, singing and dancing and things like that. Some of it had to do with the animation style being slightly different from what they were used to, or even the storyline. Now, if this movie were to get another chance, what I would love to see is to go a little bit deeper into the story of the Atlanteans themselves, because I recently rewatched the animated version and I really liked it. And, Michael J. Fox as a voice actor, to me, was the perfect choice for this also. Um, so I'm not mad at it at all, but I would like to see a little bit more about living in Atlantis. What is that like? If they were to do another reboot, you usually have, especially if it's a live action, you usually have um, a little bit more developed characters. For example, Kida, the princess, we get to know her and she becomes this huge part of the story, but we don't really know what the social or hierarchical structures are too well before we get thrown into that story. So if they were to just flesh that out a little bit more, I think that would be really, really good. Especially if it's going to be live action, then, we kind of have to expect that. And again, I think this movie can also benefit from the advancements that have been made in movie making. All right, this is where I tell you to go refill your coffee cup or your tea mug or grab another drink, because we're going to move into maybe a somewhat more controversial picks. All right? So, did you get something? Good. Now sit down and we're going to get to number 5. Now, for number 5, I have one that's not too old, actually. Strange World. Now, this movie came out in 2022, and I believe it was one of the first ones to actually go to movie theaters instead of straight to streaming, since, COVID and all that trouble that we went through. But in theaters, it was a disappointment. I watched it on streaming. I don't even think they made it to theaters here in the Netherlands. I'm not sure. Either way, I saw it on streaming, and I can see what they tried to do. So the guy who pitched the original movie had worked on Moana, so he did have the credits. For me, the story was a little bit too on the nose. So what makes this movie, in my eyes, a contender for a reboot, a refresh, a remake, whatever you want to call it, is that they can do better on the story. Because the intention is there, the premise is there. It just, the execution needs work. So in my eyes, you kind of need to James Cameron this thing. So if you look at the Avatar movies and how those are made, I think something like that kind of execution on a story like Strange World would work very well. Mostly because Avatar, I have to level with you guys, I haven't seen the second one. But the first one, we all know it's kind of a ripoff of Pocahontas, right? Story-wise. But the execution was done so well that people didn't mind. So there's this way of telling a story, even if it's a flawed story, that can still make it an appealing movie. And I think Strange World was also overshadowed by a lot of the peripheral stuff going on. Like there was the first openly gay character, and people thought that was a problem because people have, I guess, nothing else to worry about in their lives, which is very sad, but it is what it is. So people like to blame those type of things for the movie not working. But the movie didn't work because the story wasn't executed the way it could have been. That's just my take on it. It was very on the nose. There was some sort of social commentary going on, but it was trying too hard to make that connection to the way we treat our planet and yada yada. So I think there's a better way of doing this, and maybe give it to James Cameron. Right. So, number 6. Perhaps another unpopular opinion for a variety of reasons, and I might be opening a can of worms here. But I have to go with Princess and the Frog. Now, contrary to, some of these other movies in this list, I really loved this movie. And I know there's a lot of criticism, from all angles, really. one of the things is that, we finally did get a black princess, but then most of the movie she's a frog instead of an actual person. And, valid criticism. Totally is. Here's the thing though. The movie did well. It did really well. But not well enough, according to Disney. They blamed it on stuff like it has princess in the title, and that's why, when Tangled came out, they didn't call it Rapunzel or anything like that, but they called it Tangled, so it would appeal to boys. So that's just a problem with the messaging, I think. The story was based on the Frog Prince, so they could have done that differently. But, who am I? They did have some discussions about calling it the Frog Princess, and there was criticism on that. They had to change some of the original ideas around where, since it takes place in the 1920s, which wasn't a great time for black people. Originally she was supposed to be a chambermaid, but then they changed it to waitress. And you do see a lot of the social structures of the time. You see that reflected in the movie, but it's never directly addressed. And I get why. And that's all fine, I suppose, for a movie like this, in this form, in this medium. If they were to do a remake, a reboot, refresh, something like that, that could be something that, it is sort of a big part of why Tiana is the way she is and why she works the way she does. So that's something that could get a little bit more emphasis to place it a little bit more in a correct historical context. I know that I'm going to have to address this because we talked about this earlier in part one of this podcast. Or if you're listening to the whole thing in one go, way in the beginning. I know that there are people who are going to be, well, if we can cast a black girl as the Little Mermaid, then now we can cast a white girl as Tiana. Can you just sit down, honestly, and go find something else to worry about in your life? Thanks. A little side tangent, by the way. After this movie, they still did a Winnie the Pooh movie that most people forgot about. But after that, they shuttered the animation department, the 2D animation department. That was only brought back really for this movie because it was first shuttered back in 2003, 4-ish after Home on the Range. And John Lasseter really wanted to make another 2D movie, so they made this one, and they did Winnie the Pooh, and that was it. So that's also unfair because the movie did relatively well. Okay? I just think it deserves more love and more support, really. Because the voice cast was fantastic and the soundtrack was fantastic. And here's the thing. Yes, you see Tiana in the parks. Yes, they just had Tiana's Bayou Adventure open in Walt Disney World and Disneyland Resort. But all the animation that you now see of Tiana is some weird 3D render, which doesn't really correspond with how we know her from the 2D animation. So, on the one hand, I know I'm calling for like a refresh or reboot or whatever, maybe a spin-off. Maybe that would be better. And then we could see that 3D render of Tiana. So it can make it more, connect more to what we're currently seeing in the parks and on TV. And I know Disney's allegedly working on the series for Tiana as well that's coming to Disney Plus. Haven't heard about it in a while, but it should be coming. So, there's somewhat of a disconnect between the movie from 2009 and the way we have Tiana now. And that gap needs to be closed. And that's what they need to do here. Alrighty then, on to number 7. Okay, so for this one, we're gonna go into a bit more of the obscure movies. So, back in the 90s, Disney started this little project, tradition, whatever, of creating animated sequels to some of their biggest hits, sequels and prequels. They did this in a different studio than, the main animation studios, which is why the animation was off in some of these because they had almost no budget and had to do it in like a whole different location and different animators and all that. But one of these movies was a third Little Mermaid movie called Ariel's Beginning. Now, this movie, they did manage to bring back some of the original voice cast, so that was cool. But what this movie did was it sort of went back in time, takes place about a decade before the original movie, and you see what happened to Ariel's mom. Now, anybody who's watched any Disney movie knows that for some reason, main characters never seem to have both their parents. So here you see what happened to Ariel's mom and how that relates to, the whole relationship with music that the entire kingdom has and all that. Great, wonderful. Here's the thing. What I would also want to know is a little bit more of the backstory between what happened between King Triton and Ursula. Because we hear different things, right? From the original movie, we know that she was banished. From the remake, we know that they're related. She's still banished, but they're related. We don't know what happened exactly. Probably a power grab at some point. But that story can be a little bit more fleshed out. So if you want to call it sort of a prequel, is it going to be sort of a villain spin-off without really censoring the villain, I guess? Or maybe you could censor the villain, but don't make her super sympathetic because then you're going to have the plot hole problem. But something like that, that would add to the story and hopefully done in a way that it doesn't ruin the original. Now, if they're going to do this, a remake like this, which I'm not saying they will, but if they would, I would hope that if it's going to be sort of a live action CG blend like they've done with the Little Mermaid remake, all well and good, don't make it as dark as the last one. It's really hard to see. Like, there is no reason that all these movies lately have been so dark. Okay? I get that in a movie theater it might work or whatever, but when you're watching at home and, there's a little bit of glare from the sun coming into your living room or anything else, it messes up the whole experience of watching the movie. Please don't make it so dark. But that being said, I would like to know what happened between Triton and Ursula. And does it have anything to do with Ariel's mom? It could. I would like to know. That was a relatively short one, wasn't it? On to the next one. For number 7, I have The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now hear me out. The original, coming out in 1996, was near flawless in my opinion. The music is hauntingly beautiful, and we all know Disney would not make an animated movie like this today. Why? Because it has themes of lust, and there's religious criticism, and all these different things that, they just wouldn't do it today because there's a lot of backlash. We live in a polarized society, all of that. That being said, when the movie came out, it was also during this whole wave, mid-90s, when Disney started adapting their animated movies for Broadway, for musicals. They did the same for Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, the reason they did this is because originally they wanted to move The Lion King to Germany, but they couldn't figure it out with negotiations, so they said, you know what, how about you guys do The Hunchback of Notre Dame instead? So it played in Germany, it played in Berlin. Now, for those of you that don't know, the entire story is based on a novel by Victor Hugo, and it did, the musical version did, of course, include a bunch of music from the animated feature and also some new songs, as they tend to do with these musicals. Now, these were done by Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz, and of course, we know Alan Menken of all the Disney songs, but he also got his start in musical theater, and Stephen Schwartz is also a huge name in musical theater. So, they brought out the big guns for this one. What makes the Broadway adaptation very different from the animated feature, and why I'm specifically calling out the Broadway version to get a reboot or a refresh or a remake, is that it's darker. And some of you might think, well, the animated one is already a little dark. Yeah, compared to what came before it, Aladdin and things like that. But this one stayed a little bit more true to the original story, as well as it had more backstory for Frollo, the evil priest. So we know a little bit more about, how he came to be this awful, awful human being. And they also took out the gargoyles, which, were in the animated feature for a lot of comic relief, but they also drew a lot of criticism because they were a lot, okay? I get why they were there, and you know, it makes sense in an animated feature like that, but there's still a lot. Now, when I say they stayed more true to the book, that means that the story itself, you know, um, is very, very different in some areas than it was from the animated feature that we saw. So, as mentioned, it's a lot darker. I don't want to give away too much, in hopes that they ever do this, but you know, who knows? Or that they bring back the musical. It didn't just play in Germany, by the way, but that's where it started. But I would love to see an adaptation of the musical version of this movie. And whether they do it in a style of animation, whether it's, you know, hand drawn, 3D, CG, live action, a combination. I say all of this and I'm thinking, oh, please don't do like 3D animation for this, or CG. That would be weird. Regardless, I would love to see a movie adaptation of this. And it would have to be a different medium than hand-drawn animation, I think, just to avoid clashing with the original 96 movie. But I think, you know, this could be, I don't know, something different for Disney. And it feels like it feels like this would be more authentic for them to do than some of the rehashes they've been doing. I don't know. Let me know what you think. All right, you guys. We're nearing the end of the list, so here we go with number 9. Okay, don't get mad at me, but I'm gonna put it in here. Pocahontas. Pocahontas was released in 1995, and, you know, at the time, it was considered to be the A movie that people were working on, and the B team was working on The Lion King, and we all know how that worked out. But that's not why I want to talk about it. Why I want to talk about it is because we know that the animated movie, you know, as a standalone, if you look at it separate from reality and separate from everything we do know, you know, historically, it's a nice movie. It's a good movie. Songs are great. Animation's beautiful. You know, the Colors of the Wind scene is still to this day one of my favorite animated scenes ever. But we all know that the way they romanticize the story can be considered to be problematic. I know that in the making of the movie, they did consult with original, with, you know, native experts, native people, including Powhatan people. And they just took some of the advice and said, yeah, that's not really going to work for us. So they didn't do it. And then apart from that, we know that a lot of the story was based on the rendition or the retelling of the story by John Smith himself, the historical character, which may or may not be accurate. And that's me being generous. I mean, we all know. Then there was an animated sequel for Pocahontas as well, Journey to a New World, where she goes to the UK and meets John Rolfe, the other guy that she eventually, you know, in real life married, or was forced to marry, probably. So here's the thing. If they do a reboot, rehash, whatever you want to call it for this, I want to see it in a docu form. Maybe a limited series type of thing where there's reenactments, somewhat of a storyline, and they can explain, because we have seen documentaries, of course, from behind the scenes of the movie, but to also bring in more about what really happened and to educate people on that. So it wouldn't be a movie per se, but it'd be sort of a, it's not a redemption of, you know, the way they handled making the original movie. But at the same time, I do think the original, you know, the 95 movie had some things that are redemption worthy, if not just the songs. But story-wise, I think they have some correcting to do, and they can do it in a way that sort of honors the original Pocahontas, the real Pocahontas. And that's something I would like to see. I'm not sure what exactly it would look like because I haven't put, you know, that much thought into it. Plus, I'm not a movie maker. I'm just not. But I do feel there's a bunch of potential here to make it better. And that would have to be in a different form than what they usually do for remakes. So that's my 2 cents. But again, I would love to know what you think. Then, finally, we've reached the 10th, or, number one, I guess, if you want to count the other way. But the final pick for what I believe is a movie that deserved better. And that movie, my friends, is Wish. I'm pausing for you to catch your breath. Oh, gasp. Yes, Wish. Okay, so it came out in 2023. We all know it was supposed to be a celebration of 100 years of animation, and it was supposed to be the sort of crowning achievement of Disney, blending all these different animation styles with a fantastic story about the origins of the wishing star. And what we got instead was, well, I did that whole episode on Wish, and I'm going to link it in the show notes for those of you who missed it. I have thoughts about what we got originally. And the biggest problem that I have with it was the music. Or at least that was the most glaring issue that I had with it. But then watching the movie, I also thought this story just makes no sense. So what I would love for Wish is that they go back to the drawing board, get out those old sketches that they had for the original story. Again, I'll link to it in the show notes where you can find out a little bit more about that. And see if they can make a better version of it. Now, for me, I know there was a lot of criticism about this whole mix of animation styles. I liked it because I like seeing something different. That being said, was this the best way they could do it? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I would love for them to get rid of all these peripheral characters that don't add to the story. I get it. 7 sidekicks like the 7 dwarfs. Haha. Okay, most of them don't do anything and, are very gimmicky. So get rid of them. Go back to some of the original concepts that you had for the movie, the original concept art. Make the villain better. Because this guy made no sense. Okay? Because honestly, we were kind of not getting why he was the bad guy, except that at some point he got a little drunk on power. But it didn't seem like his intentions were so bad. So, the Asha's motivation in the movie made no sense to a lot of people. So this is all stuff that could have been done better. And again, it's again with being so on the nose with certain things, there's no need. So if you look at Once Upon a Studio, the short that was released, that one is full of nostalgic references. And it could be as subtle as that little instrumental Feed the Birds playing in the background when Mickey looks up at Walt Disney's picture, because we all know that was Walt Disney's favorite song. That is a touching, subtle, moving tribute. And it doesn't require 7 gimmicky sidekicks. Okay? There are so many other ways to do this. There would have been so many other ways to do this. And I had such high hopes for this movie. So, keep the stuff that worked. Which I know is subjective, but again, I like the animation style. Maybe they combine it a little bit differently in the next one or in the next iteration of this. But I'm trying to think of other stuff I liked about this movie. Oh boy. Anyway, it deserved better. That's all I can say. It deserved a whole lot better. And if Disney is continuing on this string of remakes and rehashes and reboots, then I hope at some point Wish gets one too. Well, congratulations on you and me. We made it to the end of this episode. And yeah, once again, I'm going to say I would love to know what you think. What movies do you think would deserve a remake or a reboot or a rehash? Personally, I think most of the movies on this list will never get remade, because the way these movies seem to be selected for remakes is, did this do well the first time around? So are people going to be curious enough to know about what we did with the remake that they're going to buy a movie ticket? And, let's be honest, the movies on this list are simply not that. That being said, I think it's worth thinking about, what are some fan favorites, or what are some things that fans think could have been done better, and let's try to do something for the fans, but we've seen the way Disney makes its choices recently, especially its cinematic choices. So I don't think any of this will happen, but it's nice to speculate and to think about it, isn't it? Anyway, once again, I would love to know what you think, so please get in touch. You can do that on Instagram at Factor Nostalgia. You can do that in a comment under the podcast on Spotify or on YouTube. You can send me an email if you're old school like that. Let me know. And while you're at it, can you please make sure that you subscribe to the channel? Also, please make sure that you share this episode with somebody who might be interested. And I know a lot of people have opinions on this, so I know you know somebody who wants to hear this. And third, please leave a rating or a review wherever you're currently listening to this. And with that, I'm gonna leave you for this week, and I'll catch you in the next episode.